here today. There's a lot of steps, a lot of things that went on along the way. Just a side note, this past week, there was the Democratic Convention held in Chicago, Illinois. And of course, absent was any Palestinian representation whatsoever, no mention. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I mean, from what I did, predictably, nothing. We did have a couple of Zionists, the same Zionist actually, who was at the Republican convention. Mr. Shmuley, I believe was his name, or I can't remember his name exactly. He was the Zionist I talked about a few weeks ago who was talking about suing Harvard University. He was speaking at the Republican convention. Now he's tweeting that he's a lifelong Democrat. So, of course, that's, again, as we're going to see today, how they've always kind of done this thing, isn't it? But one careful thing I wanted to point out, or something that really needs to be noted, was in the Republican convention, we didn't have any prayer rooms. And the Democratic convention, there was a prayer room for Muslims. However, it was unisex and encouraging men and women, from what I've gathered, basically at least, to pray in the same space on top of each other, practically. So it kind of really sums it up, does it? The Republicans are pretty upfront. They don't want any Muslim representation. But the Democrats are like, oh, we love Muslim votes, but as long as you're gay and you're a feminist and you subscribe to all these other haram, democratic ideologies, you're more than welcome to obviously participate. But we're not going to talk about Palestine, of course, and we're not going to talk about the genocide, and we're not going to give any kind of a platform to Palestinians to speak about what's really going on there. So really something I just wanted to add here in the beginning. Now we will officially begin the presentation. We left off in May of 1948, May 14th to be exact. The declaration of the State of Israel was made. The United States, within 11 minutes, would recognize that. We had covered the Civil War. That was rebellion of the resolution of the UN 181, which was the partition plan for Palestine. We expressed both the Zionist as well as the Arab arguments in that particular discourse. And as always, I recommend anyone who does not see the first three parts, you can watch every part independently, but it is much more detailed if you watch it from the beginning, really to understand how we got to this point, because we don't have a lot of time to really backtrack and go through all the massive amounts of information that we've laid out here. So the mandated system was to end. British control was gone. A mandated system at this point had been about 28 years. British had already announced plans that they would be slowly evacuating. Britain was tired. No more war. They were done with it. They were done keeping peace. You can say we talked about how British soldiers were assaulted by Zionist terrorist organizations time and time again. Britain was exhausted, and they wanted a way out. We talked about how Jewish influence was building a massive army. We talked about Golda Meir raising about 46 million. We talked about America pledging, I believe it was 128 off the top of my head. 128 million was raised in less than a 2-year period, which was to fund the Zionist war efforts. We talked about Czechoslovakia promising arms to the Arabs that were never delivered. On the other hand, of course, the arms were conveniently delivered to the other side. So where we're going to go today, we are going to go back a month in time, because there was a particular event which was too big to cover in the last presentation. It actually happened in April, right before the State of Israel was declared. It's known as the Dar Yasin massacre. We are going to cover that. We are going to show how this is an attack that really was ahead of its time. It was a unfortunate precursor to Zionist tactics that would go on well into the future. It was a sign of things to come. We will talk about the Dar Yasin massacre in our opening. We also are going to talk about the continuing building of the Israeli war machine and how much more powerful it would gain in the next year. We are going to be covering, again, a period of 5 months' time from May of, actually we go to Dar Yasin from April, would be about a 6-month period here. In a little window, we are going to see the Arabs squabbling in conflicts and ineptitude, if you will, in the war. We are going to see how Israel put together a polished and fully functional military in a very short period of time, or did they? How long had they been planning this? We'll see that buildup was gradual, and it would really hit a fever pitch, during these next 5 months as the dark clouds of war lied ahead. So we're going to go back in time from where we left off last, to April 9th of 1948. This would be known as the Dar Yasin massacre, which is one of the most classic example of war crimes, ruthless aggression, heartless bloodbath. I mean, this was basically a nightmare for anyone who happened to be on the receiving end of this, as we are going to describe. Not all the horrors, as some are really too disgusting and graphic to depict. But on the morning of April 9th, Ergun and our good friends, the Stern Gang, who we've covered quite a bit in the last two parts, began to approach the village from multiple directions. This is a small village consisting basically of about 144 houses, not very big. What they would use for the attack was simply raining fire on the village, combination of firearms, hand grenades being thrown inside the village on unsuspecting villagers, as we are going to get here in a minute as to why they were unexpected. How impromptu of an attack was this? Was there anything that provoked this? Was there anything that led up to this? Were there any motivations that can even be defended for this? We are going to see that here in a minute. To sum this, horrible day up, 110 total were killed, while some have reported as high as 254. I tend to always try to take the middle ground. Obviously the Zionist side is going to report under because they don't want to, especially as the international backlash to this. They are not going to want to, own up to all their crimes. They're going to tend to go low. And then, of course, you have motivations on all sides. The other side tends to go high. So we see between 110, 254. You probably can safely say about 200 plus people perished, brothers and sisters of ours. Some Palestinians were paraded even after this. They were captured, the ones who surrendered. And their reward was they were paraded through the streets of Jerusalem and ultimately executed. Now, I want to keep that in mind as we go later on, as we get into the war. And I want you to see exactly when it was reversed, what went on. How did the Arab armies treat the Israelis that they were capturing, opposed to what happened here? The village would completely be looted, ransacked, destroyed, all the homes burned, large quantities of flour, sugar, petrol, fuel, all kinds of things. Anything pretty much that wasn't, worthless was looted during this. This attack obviously met the condemnation of the international community. King Abdullah, what was that? Did Sheikh Ibrahim say something? Oh, okay. No worries. The attack would be condemned by the Haganah, the Jewish agency of the government responsible for the war effort, and a letter of apology was formally sent to King Abdullah, which of course he refused to accept. Most of the world who knew of this attack reacted obviously with horror. But this attack was a featured port, and of course, for the Haganah to pretend they didn't know about this, obviously it probably wasn't supposed to get out, and it got out because this was part of what they called Plan Delay, which the aim of this was to ethnically cleanse British-mandated Palestine before the declaration of the Jewish state. So they have a plan here, a military operation to do what? Ethnically cleanse. Anyone who's never heard that term, which you have to be lying under a rock the last 20 some odd years, pretty much get rid of everybody. Kill anything that moves. You're ethnically cleansing the area of all people who are there. So for them to, again, pretend like they didn't know this was happening is just, it's a far stretch. The village, again, totaled about 600 to 1,000, depending on how many you ask. 1,000 people, basically is more, about 900 or 1,000, you say is more safe. As I mentioned earlier, there's about 144 houses here. And this community had been living in harmony with the Jewish neighbors, particularly Givat Shaul, which was a settlement that was located in close proximity. The relationship was so strong, some of these brave Jews who got wind of this had went there to try to intervene and actually stop, this massacre. They were to no avail. Their efforts were to no avail, obviously, but there was a relationship here. These were not combatants. These were not the so-called terrorists that we hear about all the time in modern day media. There was a truce. These people were like, what's going on here? Why are we being, and then before it's too late, I mean, you're already being massacred, and just record numbers of dead in front of you. Later on, Menachem Begum would state that there were militia in the village and they would randomly attack Jewish settlers in surrounding cities. This took a couple of years later for him to make this statement. And again, I want to ask the audience, does that sound familiar? Every time they do something, there's always terrorists in there. The hospital, there's a terrorist. He's in the basement. There's a playground with the children. All the terrorists are underneath the merry-go-round. I mean, it's always something that they come up with, and it's just been used so many times, and people blindly, accept it. If there really were terrorists there and these attacks were prepared to be carried out, why did brave Jews risk their life to try to save these people? There was a truce. There was no hostilities. This is known. He waited 2 years later. It was like, yeah, now that we're an official state, we're in the UN, we need to try to clean up our image, a bit. And obviously you had this stuff coming. And again, during the attack, the villagers did fight valiantly, but simply, I mean, they didn't have the arms, they didn't have the numbers, they didn't have the weapons. And this story here really recounts kind of, how it all began. I'm going to read the quote here. From 5 a.m. to about 11 a.m., there was a systematic slaughter, with them going from house to house. From the eastern edge of the village, nobody came out unhurt. Whole families were slaughtered. At 6 in the morning, they caught 21 young people from the village, about 25 years old average. They stood them in a row near where the post office is today and executed them. Many women who watched this horrifying spectacle went crazy, as naturally they would. Some are still in mental institutions, one who survived to this day from what they had witnessed for their sons, their brothers, their fathers, their uncles. These were the strong men in these ladies' sisters' lives. And just watching this be done to these men who they most likely admired and looked up to. Again, these were the men of their family. A pregnant woman who was coming back with her son from the bakery was murdered, and her belly was smashed. They had to get those terrorists, right? And after her son was killed before her eyes, one of the conquered village houses, a Bren machine gun was set up, which shot everyone who got in its line of fire. My cousin went out to see what happened to his uncle, who was shot a few minutes before, and he was also killed as well. His father, who went out after him, was murdered by the same Bren, and the mother who came to find out what happened to her loved ones died beside them. And again, this was from a gentleman by the name of Aish Idan, who was on guard in Gir Shavat, one of the Jews who we talked about earlier, who basically came over and, witnessed all of this. There are many more, stories that I would not share that I read while putting this together. I mean, of course, untold amounts of rapes, virgin girls being humiliated in front of their fathers. And they know in the Muslim culture how important, this father-daughter relationship is. And of course, these people, as I mentioned the other day, when we look at them, we can't look at them as normal human beings. These people have no empathy. I mean, I don't care how much I despise the people in my life. I never envisioned once, smashing the baby in a pregnant mother's womb. I mean, that's just when you start getting into that level of just soullessness. I mean, the only demonic, is really the only choice of words that we could have here. And when you hear the lying, bastards in the media, when they always want to come and they want to say these things about little Israel, their right to defend themselves, these stories are never told, obviously, and people need to know them. For those of you who've never heard of Dar Yasin, it's something that you could definitely look into and really just gain a different perspective on what we're dealing with here. These people do not play by normal rules, of decency. 1949, despite protests, the land of Dar Yasin would be converted into the Jewish neighborhood known as Givat Shal Betz, still in place to this day. Numerous members of the Jewish communities said this was horrific. And as always, we point out the good behaviors. Not all Jews are like this. Not all Jews are Zionists. Not all subscribe to this level of barbarity. And we saw that there's a lot of protests. The Israeli government obviously did not care. So now we move back forward into the beginning of the collection of coalition that was going to go in here after the state of Israel was declared. King Abdullah of Jordan had aspirations. He supported the partition plan originally, as we talked about in the last episode, UN Resolution 181. He wanted the West Bank area of mandated Palestine for himself. He wanted this to be annexed to Jordan. In order to keep the British from supporting the plan, King Abdullah would not agree to attack the Jewish state. So Abdullah agreed, you give us the West Bank, here you go, we're not going to attack the Jewish state. We will stand back. But he wanted, of course, that land. There would be pressure from all the various Arab states onto Abdullah into supporting an all-out invasion. They felt, like I've been highlighting in the past parts, that now is the time. If you don't go now, all they're going to do is continue to use that international influence, and they are going to build an unstoppable war machine, and there's not going to be much that you're going to be able to do about it. Time was of the essence. He was viewed by leaders of the region, as a Jewish Western puppet. And the more things change, the more they remain the same when it comes to that family who's occupying the high positions of power within that country. But Abdullah wanted to view himself as sort of a Arab supreme commander. He was the representative. He was the leader, and he was going to take the reins, of this effort. King Farouk of Egypt had aspirations of his own also, and he longed basically to take his, piece of the pie. And we're going to see this problem with the way that the Muslims and the Arabs think, and I'm going to do a section on this coming up later, of how the Zionists think and how the Arabs think, night and day, when it comes to the unity, when it comes to working together as a collective. Egypt wanted the southern territories to be under Egyptian control. So you have Jordan over here wanting this. You have Egypt over here wanting this. What about the people who lived in the land? Again, we see that is often just being neglected here. Leadership in Iraq wanted the entire Fertile Crescent under their control, and Syria and Lebanon wanted their slice of the pie also as well. They wanted the northern territories. So again, what about the people who all of this is about, who were denied their rights under the Article 22 of the League of Nations, who were listed as a Class A mandate, who were going to be given sovereignty? Do they not matter? Again, it's an afterthought among these leaders at this point. All this was going on with building distrust, obviously, as I was kind of briefly highlighting, among the Palestinian leaders who just simply wanted the land back that was promised to them under Article 22. So this distrust and greed and infighting would doom the Arab efforts before it even began. And again, as I want to stop here on this before we progress, is that I remember I had highlighted this in the last part, how the Zionists operate as a collective. Still to this day, when they take over something, it's in the family, it never goes outside. You don't see them fighting amongst themselves outside of surface level basic stuff. But when it comes to these agendas, they are clear, they are together. But when you look at the Muslims, the Pakistani group over here, you got the Iraqi group over here, you got the Egyptian Arab, you got the Algerian, you got this, the Western Muslims. It's all fractionalized. We have no unity whatsoever. How are they able to do what they're doing today? Because of this reason. We are too busy with, I'm national, I'm Pakistani, I'm English, I'm French, I'm Egyptian, and all that usual rah-rah, when that wasn't how we were in our golden era, in our greatest period. We were not this way. And you can see it here, aspirations, greed, corruption of the rulers, doing us in just exactly like it's doing us in now. And again, as I highlighted, the more things change, the more, unfortunately, they're remaining the same. And in fact, I believe getting worse as the years go by, because what's coming next is Western individualism, which is what's been promoted in this country and in Europe for the last 6 decades. And again, that individualism teaches you don't have part of a whole. You are about yourself and only caring about yourself. And that ideology is all well rooted now in the Muslim world as well. So expect it to get worse before it's going to get better. God forbid, maybe we will turn things around, inshallah. So before the war officially kicked off, you've got basically Operation Balak, which we would talk about in last week. There was an estimated one weapon for every fighter. Operation Balak was the importing of weaponry from Czechoslovakia. So as we highlighted in the last one, this was already going on because they knew what they were going to do. They knew what was coming. They were preparing for it. On May 13th, France would authorize shipments of weapons also to Tel Aviv, along with Belgium, Switzerland, numerous other areas in Europe. So you're seeing again now, it's escalating. They're getting even more arms. They're getting loaded up. Now they also did something else. They increased the immigration numbers, as well. We would see 10,300 immigrants on average per month. Remember, we talked about the white paper a few episodes ago and how the British were trying to limit this. Now it's far exceeding the worst nightmares that even could have been foreseen during that time. By the end of the year, the Israelis would have 88,033 soldiers And out of this total, 60,000 approximately would be engaged in combat. In addition to supplying weapons, Czechoslovakia also did something that we're going to see later that's very key here: aircraft and fighter planes. Now you're seeing the beginning of the air dominance that's going to happen in this war, with the Israeli Air Force taking superior position. This was not the case in the beginning, but it's going to become the case as we are going to see. The Zionists would amass light tanks, vehicles, weapons once the British blockade was lifted, because the British, after they pulled out the mandate, they had previously a blockade because they were still controlling the territory. So what they were trying to do was stop the immigrants from coming in and stop the Zionists from loading up. This is what Operation Balak did, was it allowed the arms to go around the blockade. But now the British were leaving. All of Europe and America could do what they wanted to do a long time ago, and that was fully arm this Zionist war machine. So right on time, no coincidence there. Once the war is about to begin, there goes the blockade, unlimited amounts of arms, tanks, weaponry, convoy equipment, everything you can imagine being given in there. Also, the Haganah would obtain stocks of British weaponry, which happened to be left behind, due to logistical reasons as the British were pulling out. So as the British were pulling out, they were under a lot of duress. We talked about how exhausted they were. Issues happened. They were getting shot by snipers, logistics, communication issues, and supply chains. They seized these weapons also as well. So they just now had an additional stockpile. Now, for the Arab side, and we compare it to the 60,000 Israelis that started this conflict, there would be 26,000 were amassed from the beginning of the war. The breakdown would be as follows. You would have 10,000 Egyptians, 4,500 Jordanians, 3,000 Iraqis, around 5,000 to 6,000 Syrians, 2,000 Arab Liberation Army volunteers, 1,000 Lebanese, and a couple of hundred people from Saudi Arabia. So you see an army about 26,000 already outmatched by an army of 60,000, and we haven't even really begun, as the gap is just going to grow. A lot of the problem with this was, as example, 80% of Egyptian men were physically deemed unready for any kind of military service, aka they were out of shape. The Israelis, on the other hand, have been putting all their citizens, as we talked about during the Civil War times, they were getting war trained. They were training men, women, teenagers, and everything for this. Their men, women were ready. They were ready to fight. They had been trained as fighters. They brought in mercenaries and all kinds of World War II veterans to aid in this training. While you had the Arabs over here, 80% of the population of a country was not even fit for warfare. You can look now at the sad state of the Muslim world and obesity rates, and I've lived there, and America's the same way, but I was shocked to find the type of obesity I saw here in the United States also being present in the Arab world and is widespread. These are not fighters. These are not people who would be prepared in any conflict to defend their home, and it's the sad state of the Muslims. Being a Muslim is about all aspects, body, mind, and soul, and yet we see all these young people obese and negligent and out of shape, and it's really just disheartening. Now, out of the most trained of the Arab contingent, we would see Jordan's Arab Legion. They were trained by the British, so these were actually trained fighting men. We mentioned there wasn't that many of them, though. They would only fight again, though, however, in areas that King Abdullah wanted for himself, aka the West Bank area. So this Jordan army, which was the most trained of all the Arabs, again, we're only fighting over here. We're not going to support. We're not going to transport. We're not going to move any troops around. We're only here for the agenda. And then France would, of course, increase, as I mentioned earlier, large sales of arms, both sides. But however, the Zionists basically denied this. And of course, the French never sent any arms at all to the Arabs, only to the French sides. So again, we're seeing here again, they had everybody, the Arabs had nothing. And then among the Arabs who were there was a constant conflicts and egos and nationality issues and things like that. So on May 15th to June 11th, we call this the first phase. In this episode tonight, we're going to cover part 1 and part 2, phase 1 and phase 2. So the initial plan was for Syria and Lebanon to invade from the north, while Jordan would invade the territories they wanted from the east. And of course, Egypt would move in from the south. So this was initially the plan. They were going to have a three-pronged attack. You were going to be hitting the Zionists north, south, and the east. West, obviously, we'll talk about that later, when naval control was not necessarily going to be an option. Now, King Abdullah would reject this plan, citing that it only served Syrian interests. And of course, it was clear that this plan his plan lined up perfectly with his objectives. Again, we talked about, he was pretty clear from the beginning. We're only going to fight in those territories. We want that. He pretty much didn't care to support this coordinated attack, if you will. So what happened was, now Lebanon, would drop out of the war. And this was largely due to Christian representation inside of Lebanon and Jewish bribes to Lebanese officials. So we haven't even fired a shot yet, and already the Lebanese are out of this conflict as well. I think the Lebanese at the time thought that maybe this would keep the Zionists off their back. As we've seen from history, that is simply obviously not the case. The French intelligence would state that the revised plan of the Arabs would contribute to Israel's success. I forgot to mention earlier, there were commentators saying the initial plan, they felt the Zionists were going to be in trouble. They would not be able to fight a three-front war. They were not equipped yet, being the key word there. So this was kind of a early, hit them when you can type of moment. But now with this revised plan, intelligence officers from all over the world, military commanders, this is very favorable to the Zionists. I wonder why. I wonder who was pulling the strings inside of some of these governments, which would allow what we're about to see. So Egypt would begin penetrating northwards along the shore of what we call the present-day Gaza Strip. It was said that had they continued their advancement, there was a broken bridge in the area and they ceased their advancement. There was no Zionist or Israeli forces between them and Tel Aviv, but they stopped and they held up, their position. So Operation Plishat would take effect, which would be the first major combat mission by the Israeli forces. They would use 4 of their planes we talked about they had acquired from Czechoslovakia. These were known as S-199s, and they would attack the Egyptian armor columns of about 500 vehicles. 70 kilograms of bombs were dropped. The attack caused the Egyptians to run and scatter and put them on the defensive immediately. So now Israel immediately achieves initiative in the war. The Arabs are backpedaling. They have the control. The most fierce fighting during phase 1 would take place in Jerusalem and the Tel Aviv road. This would feature the Arab Legion of Jordan, who we talked about previously, the most equipped and trained of these forces. Due to Egyptian advancements, Israelis would abandon the Latrun fortress, which was a key strategic point early on, one of the few Arab strongholds that they would actually gain during this conflict. The Jordanians used a strategic point to cut off supplies to Israeli fighters who were located in Jerusalem. So first move, cut up a barrier, stop the supply chain, take the Latrun fortress. They took over this. 586 Israelis would perish trying to reclaim this territory, opposed to only 90 dead for the Arabs. So we're seeing here, this is kind of the only really good news that we are going to see during the course of this conflict. It's going to be mostly way in the opposite side after this. But again, with the new plan, this gave them time to reinforce, time to rebuild and load up. The Berber Road would be the bypass, which was built by the Israelis to deliver troops and whatnot to Jerusalem. So this road was very important. King Abdullah had ordered Glub Pasha to enter Jerusalem on May 17th. 10K artillery were fired per day in the siege. House-to-house fighting would ensue, and Arab forces were successfully able to drive out the Israelis from the Arab-controlled cities and the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. 1,500 were expelled and several were detained. Now, here's where I mentioned earlier, we talked about Dar Yasin. I wanted you guys to remember what they did to us versus how we handled them. The Arab Legion would escort the Israelis out to protect them from the angry mobs of Arabs who were obviously very traumatized in what they had been witnessing over the last 30 years of their lives. Also knowing about the Dar Yasin massacre, there was a lot of Arab people, justifiably so, who were very angry. And the Arab Legion protected them. They gave them an escort with vehicles. We're also going to see how this was done again later by the Zionists in a different incident. And again, how we see the respect that was given to the non-combatants by the Arab forces opposed to what we see again from the Zionists. So at the beginning of all this, the air war favored, of course, the Royal Egyptian Air Force. As more effective air defenses would continue to be acquired, this would be short-lived. As again, the Egyptian Air Force would continue to use its capabilities. 25 S-199s would arrive from Czechoslovakia, along with 62 Spitfires, which was a significant upgrade. So the Israelis were now getting upgraded aircraft, which far exceeded the S-199s. In fact, these Spitfires were British, and were based. The Nazis had a counter to these in World War II, but they were pretty good planes for the time. So they had 62 of these to go along with 25 more Avias. And now, again, it's now going to completely turn to the airfare would be owned by the Israelis at this point. So the Israelis began a bombing campaign on Amman. This was payback to the Arab Legion. Well, unfortunately for the Israelis at the time, at least, during this campaign, they actually hit a British airfield. So the British issued a threat which they would, of course, intervene. And we never saw Amman attacked again. So one time the Israelis took advantage of that superior air power to attack Amman, Jordan, but accidentally hit a British air base, and they got the hay. And of course, Israel at the time was not going to be capable of dealing with, if there was any, most likely there probably wouldn't have even been a retaliation if they hadn't done it. Again, as we look at things in the past that have already transpired. Israel also seized control of the sea. Haifa would become the main base. Submarine chaser was purchased from good old Uncle Sam in the United States at a discount price. They would refurbish old warships. And it was no mystery early on in the war that unprecedented control of the sea and the ports belonged to the Zionists. So we're seeing early in the first phase, the battle for Jerusalem, Latrun over here. We saw the Egyptians trying to push up in the top, limited effect of the Syrian advancement. Lebanon already dropped out. That significantly weakened the northern front. And now we see Israel has taken control of the air. So the Arab Legion gained limited during this phase. They needed more time. They needed to hit them fast because a war machine, again, as I mentioned before, was being built by the hour. In July, the IDF now had 63K troops. By the spring, we mentioned they'd have about 115. In contrast, the Arab army during this period of time would have 4K and would rise only to 55,000 by October. So again, this is what they were up against. The immigrants were coming in. We talked about 10,300, I believe it was, coming in per month. So a truce was implemented to cease the fighting. The Arab forces would control only 14 settlements after this truce, which 14, out of the 14, only one was basically part of the partition plan for Israel. So basically the Arabs had just maintained control over some of their own previously mandated from the UN resolution territory. Now, contrast that on the other side, the IDF would have control over 9 Arab cities, not in the partition territory. So the Zionists grabbed 9 cities that were originally in the partition plan mandated to Palestine. The Arabs would only grab 1. Total from all this, we found 315 Syrians were killed. 450 were wounded. Iraq had 200 killed, 500 wounded. Jordan had 300 killed, 400 to 500 wounded. Egypt had 600 killed, 1,400 severely wounded. 800 Jews were taken hostage compared to 1,300 Arabs who were mostly Palestinian villagers, civilians, freedom fighters, and whatnot. The Israeli numbers are not really disclosed, but they are significantly less compared to estimates that we do have into what the Arab forces suffered. Israel only really suffering one major defeat, which at Latrun, trying to reconquer that particular area. This truce would last 28 days only. And during that 28-day period, something interesting would happen again. They would place another embargo because the UN was tasked to manage and regulate and police this area and make sure that this partition plan came to fruition. They were there to keep the peace. They didn't want any more arms, any more immigrants, any more outside sources. And this is a very key quote on that coming up from an unnamed British officer who stated anonymously at the time, "This truce will be used by the Jews to continue training and continue to grow their army, while the Arabs will spend their time arguing over land and spoils of war." And this, again, is an outsider saying this. How accurate, he was, because that's exactly what happened during the truce. Infighting among the Arabs, and the Israelis were out there building, training. And as we're going to see as we get into the next phase, it completely flips. 30 to 35,000 men, in fact, would boost for the Israeli army, increasing numbers of machine guns. It got really lopsided during this period of time. Bernadotte, he would basically be appointed to lead a UN team of observers. He reported 3 violations that had gone on during the time of this treaty. Violation 1, immigrants and war materials were breaking the embargo lines and coming into Israel, as everyone knew they would, violating the treaty. But the Arabs, on the other hand, had theirs as well. Egyptian forces were preventing relief convoys from going to Jerusalem, and you had the Jordanian groups were suppressing water from going into Jerusalem. So you did have violations here on both sides, really no option, on point of the Arabs to try to do whatever little they could. And Bernadotte would produce a new partition plan trying to end this, once and for all. A Palestinian Arab state alongside Israel and a union to be established between Israel and Jordan, the West Bank. Jerusalem would go to the Arabs, with Jewish areas being considered independent municipalities. So that was the plan. Give Jordan what King Abdullah wanted, mandate the rest of the territories as before, declare Jerusalem this Arab city, but you would have Jewish independent governments that would not be under Arab sovereignty living side by side in those areas. And then the rest of the territories would go to Israel. Israel rejected this plan because they wanted Jerusalem all along. And if you go back to the original plan, they accepted it. As I said, what they tell you on Monday is not their plans. It's just buying time. They were all more than happy to say Jerusalem is international. But now, because they see what's happening, they know they're about to get it. And now their tune is changing, a little bit. And also part of Bernadotte's plan was a 28-day extension of the ceasefire. Of course, he wanted to, get more time in there. The Jews, of course, rejected this. The Arabs rejected it as well. The Arabs, again, like I said, they felt the iron was hot. You have to hit it now. The Zionists basically felt they pretty much were strong. They were going to take these territories. They didn't need to have it negotiated away from them. By war, they were going to conquer these areas. So we now move into the second phase of the war. This was a period of multiple 10-day battles, if you will. And it took place between July 8th to 18th. Egyptians would begin by attacking Negba. Negba was a strategic commune settlement, not really big, but a strategic point on the map that they could conquer, set up, and start running, supply chain and troops into the area. And from there, they would launch their aggressive offensives on Tel Aviv. Israel's would counter with their own offensives. Of course, the IDF would carry out several operations, one known as Death to the Invader. This operation would feature several villages. So they would begin by, and again, Death to the Invader shows again how the Zionists are viewing the people whose land they are taking. They're the invader. These are not, combatants they're attacking here. These are not Egyptian strong posts. These are Arab civilian areas that they're going into and attacking. And what they would do is simply go in the area, expel the citizens, kick them out. This time, because of Dar Yasin, they didn't do what they really wanted to do, which is kill them all and then take all their possessions. They just kicked them out, took their possessions, and so on. And again, sound familiar. It's exactly what they're doing today. Is you blow up the community, you destroy the community, destroy the infrastructure, destroy the homes, drive the people out.
There's something very important, brother. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, Dar Yasin is exactly 7 miles from Al Masjid Al Aqsa. Dar Yasin, where they killed everyone in Dar Yasin, the village actually next to the Masjid Al Aqsa. Their plan actually Masjid Al Aqsa itself. I'm sorry to interrupt, brother.
Oh, no worries.
Brother Yusuf, Nakba is disaster. And in 67, the disaster, especially all the Arab leaders cannot do anything. Sorry, brother. Continue.
Oh, no
please.
worries. You have that perspective as someone who's seen these places, traveled the roads, and been there. For me, it's reading through history books and statements and accounts. So anything you have to add is always tremendously valuable. And again, they would destroy the homes, and this is again the same policy we see them enacting today. They bulldoze Palestinian homes, they kick them out, and then what do? They build in its place, and they're building their settlements on graveyards. On July 12th, the Egyptian forces would again launch offensives against Negba. They would suffer a defeat, losing between 200 to 300, while the Israelis would only lose 5. So as we talked about, the longer the time waited, the more the war machine was going and ready to attack. They would proceed to attack more settlements, including Beirut, Yitzhak, where they ran into fierce opposition until the IDF forces arrived. So they're trying to expand as well. The Israelis, as we talked about, these citizens were trained. They were armed. So the resistance in these cities was much more formidable than what you were finding in the Palestinian settlements. So you had basically IDF enforcements arrive, 200 more Egyptians would be killed, while there was only basically 17 Israelis, another lopsided defeat during an aggressive attack. Outmanned, outgunned, outtrained. There would be no more offensives after this. This was kind of the end of Egypt's day in the sun, if you will. Very short day in the sun in this war. It wouldn't even last the period of a month. Their air force was obliterated. They suffered setback after setback. They were outgunned. The air defenses of the Israelis were superior, and they would pretty much not even be a factor at this point. Now, Israel will launch Operation Denny, which was a plan to secure the corridor between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. This was, again, part of their bigger plan. They rejected Bernado's partition plan. They knew they were going to get Jerusalem. It was just a matter of time. So one of the main objectives in this plan was a city known as Lydda. This was an Arab stronghold, which was lending support to the surrounding cities. You found local militia, about 1,000 strong, and 125 to 300 Arab Legion soldiers were there. However, the IDF amassed 8,000. And we showed earlier, we talked about total troop counts. I mean, the Jordanians only put a couple thousand, it was like 3,500. The Israelis at this point in time had 66,000, active men plus trained civilians. And they would capture the city easily. Only 10 casualties in compared to 450 Arabs. So another just lopsided defeat that we see. The next day, a city named Rami fell on July the 12th. The civilian population was expelled without any provisions. This is what I mentioned earlier, what happened in Jerusalem, the type of respect that the Arab forces showed the Israelis. They gave them a convoy. They protected them. They gave them transportation and provisions to make sure they safely were to a destination where they could, settle in. However, when these people did it, they just said, whatever your 2 arms and your 2 legs, you go. If you were a mother with a baby, you were carrying the baby. And it was in blistering hot July. Numerous Palestinians would perish, in the desert from heat stress, heat stroke, as we also know it as, exhaustion, just sheer fatigue and brokenness. Horrible, again, because we saw the example on the other side of exactly how they were treated, opposed to how the Arabs were treated by them. Israel's forces now would march on Latrun. They wanted this because this was key to getting Jerusalem. They would break the second truce. This would come up here in a minute, but we're just talking about Latrun in general right now. And they would attack it the first time, failing to capture the city. This was a big setback for them. One of the last remaining, say Arab victories or strategic was in this particular region, but that would change very quickly. Lower Galilee, including the Nazareth area, would be captured on July the 16th, but Eastern Galilee would stay in control. They wouldn't have, but not Eastern Galilee. I misphrased myself there. And this would cost 200 Syrians during this seizure and only 100 Israeli casualties. So again, doubling the number. So at this point, there would be a second truce initiated. We've seen, again, more advancements from the period of the ending of the first truce to the second. They grew even more. This truce would last from July 18th all the way to October the 15th. So on September 16th, Bernadotte would again propose his second attempt to try to quell this, a new partition plan, if you will. The plan would keep Jerusalem as an international city. So this was reflecting the original partition plan of about a year ago that was proposed by the UN. A Jewish state in the whole of Galilee, with the area spanning from Fallujah northeast towards Ramla and Lydda. Ramla and Lydda would be annexed by Jordan, and Negev would be divided between Jordan and Egypt. Another key addition would be that all Palestinian refugees who had been leaving before the war, during the Civil War, they would be allowed to return. So again, Jerusalem's international city, giving the Zionists control of all of Galilee for the pretty much, and then giving Jordan its territory, Egypt an area in the south, and then the rest to be mandated Palestine. The following day, Bernadotte would be shot. He would be assassinated by, guess who? The Stern Gang, also known as Lehi. A four-man team would ambush his convoy and would kill him in Jerusalem, along with a French UN observer. And right here we see again, this is the envoy, who is responsible for securing peace in the region. And he is killed in the middle public, ambushed by someone who did it. Wasn't a mystery, wasn't a false flag, and yet there are zero repercussions for this. Had this been any other people, any other time, any other nation, you would have had first a collective condemnation of such, this is terrorism. I mean, this man did nothing but try to come up with a compromise. Granted, both sides didn't like it, but he tried to come up with a compromise based on the British white paper, the original mandate followed up by the official mandate. He wasn't a war criminal. He was not somebody who the Zionists viewed him as an Arab puppet because he wasn't giving them everything they wanted, and they executed him. International diplomat, appointed, by the nations of the world, of the industrialized and civilized world, and killed in broad daylight. And zero repercussions for this. As I said, first there would have been international condemnation. There could have been sanctions. There could have been numerous things that would have gone on to any other nation, but not this nation, of course, because when you control the banks, as Rothschild famously said, give me control of currency, I care not who makes the laws. And because they control the currency, they control the governments. Because they control the media, they control public opinion. No one probably even flicked an eyelid at this, during the time. I couldn't find really many examples other than hollow statements of condemnation. So he's out of the way, now. And now they can really begin to start to escalate things, a little bit more. But something key would happen, just a few days after his assassination. On September 22nd, the Provisional State Council passed what they called the Area of Jurisdiction and Power Ordinance. Now, in plain English, what that means was any land conquered by the Jewish state during this war and in future wars would never be returned. They would annex all the land. This is something they had set up and they knew they were going to do from the beginning of this. This war was only about provoking the Arabs. They knew what they were going to be able to do. They knew they were going to be able to win. They were just going to slowly slice up more and more territory. You had Arab leaders in their pocket. You had the UN in their pocket. You had all the arms dealers in their pocket, the American government, all the Czechoslovakian and Soviet Union support. They knew where they were going. They just made it official right here, that once they take a territory, it belongs to them. They are never giving it back. So when they move in, God forbid, to Gaza, you can remember this because they called their shots over 70 years ago, that once they take the territory, it's not coming back. The only way you're ever going to get it back is not the diplomatic table. It's not in discussions and councils. It's going to have to be an armed conflict. And they're living out to that creed. They always have. They continue to grow the state. We can look at the maps. And as we progress in this series next week, I know this last two parts, we really only covered about 2 years because a lot happened, during this 2 year time that was very important to the story, showing how they built it up, showing how they slowly conquered the land, showing the Arab division, all these lessons for the Muslims that we can apply to our modern day lives and see exactly what is going on, how fractured and divided we are. We are not unified. We can't beat anybody. We used to have one of the most powerful forces on this planet, no longer. I mean, we, to be honest, lack of a better term, we are a joke at this point. We are having parties in Saudi Arabia while Palestine burns. You see all the Arab governments there quick to organize concerts and dance shows and nightclubs, but they can't put together an army. We talked about the 80% of the Egyptian men in 1948 were unfit for military service. I guarantee if you go to any Muslim nation now, with a few exceptions, you are going to find similar statistics, just like you find in the United States of America. You'd find people who don't have a fighting spirit, who are not willing to stand up for anything. And if you fail to stand for anything, you're going to fall for anything. And ultimately, right now, we are seeing why we are losing. You know, Allah puts us under the test. You know, hardship builds strength, it builds character. And the Muslim world has probably never been lower, you know, than it is at this point in history. And I hope this has been really informative so far. People are really enjoying it, seeing how we got to this point. Because what we're seeing now is not by accident. As we're going to continue to build in this series, and we're going to start exposing other actors who are going to come into this story. That's what they are. That's why I use that name is not by accident. And we're going to learn new actors, new stories, new corruption, new manipulation. It's all just going to increasingly make more and more sense. Sheikh, you have anything you want to add?
My brother, Jazakallah khair. Brother, yeah, and I have a house in Fallujah right now. I have a house belong to my grandfather, and my father he was the chief of his village in that time, Fallujah, and then supposed to be the Egyptian army and the Jordanian army to help my grandfather and whoever around him. And believe it or not, the whole village, include my grandfather, my grandmom, my uncle, two uncles, they completely destroyed everything. Everything. And who helped the Egyptian army until now, by the way, and the Jordanian army, and those people until this moment, they tried to hurt us. That my brother Yusuf is right. Unfortunately, we don't have one single Muslim leader, period. All the Muslim leaders corrupted. Plus, Brother Yusuf didn't mention that true scholars and ulama about Islam, now either they are in prison, especially in Saudi Arabia. As I mentioned, Brother Yusuf spoke about Saudi Arabia, the most corrupted country. Two countries, number one, Saudi Arabia and Emirates. The most corrupted Muslim country ever. That's why, until now, why we don't have victory, why we cannot do anything with a small number of people. Why? Because we are not united. We're not together. But inshallah, I believe the majority of Sunnah followers, females, and definitely have kids. Your kids is a trust and amana. Those kids, they can do something. They will speak the truth, nothing but the truth. Brother used to bring details, Jazakallah khair for that. And I really wish, my dear brother and sister, to share this as soon as possible. It's very important. Very important. Yes, Sunnah for us, we teach what halal and haram very well. Sister Layla is the best with that, mashallah. But also this topic is amana for every Muslim. Is amana, trust for every Muslim. You have to spread the message as soon as possible. And Brother Yusuf, may Allah protect you and save you from those people who try to hurt you because you're speaking the truth, but nothing but the truth. Jazakallah khair.
Yeah, thank you. And always the people, there's not a lot of men right now listening, and people who tend to take the approach where if I just sit back, it won't happen to me. Well, as we're going to be learning throughout not just this series, but others, no one will be left alone. No nation will be spared by these people. What they're doing to the Palestinians to now is the same thing they want to do to all of us, you know, at the end of the day. They have global domination ideas. They have visions, which I'm going to expose on this channel in the next year through several series that I have. Next, we're going to take on the entertainment industry. We're going to show who runs that. We're going to expose the Satanism, child sacrifice, and how those musical artists that the youth idolize so much, who they really are, where they really come from.